Kia ora tātou, my name's Lewis Brown. I work at the National Library. I'm wearing a number of different hats, I guess, including Digital New Zealand. And today's forum, or this afternoon's forum, is, as you can see on the screen, about unlocking public value and meeting the challenge of open data and information, particularly for cultural heritage organisations. I thought it was a really interesting start this morning with Michael Edson's keynote because he revealed a change in thinking and practice for the Smithsonian of seeing users as a protagonist, as the participant and the makers and doers in terms of content, and not just audiences to be passively broadcast to. He drew this distinction between those who thought the web was just a mechanism to have a bigger megaphone and those who actually understand that it's a fundamentally new way of getting things done. In this world, unnecessarily restricted content, he said, is a barrier to innovation. So what we're seeing, perhaps, is a movement, and again, in his words, coming from a standing start, of unlocking content for public benefit, of not just providing thumbnails and catalogues, but high-resolution images and full access to data and information in a common space where it can be reused, mashed up, and really taken ownership of. This movement is based on relationships of trust and then not legalistic enforcement. So there are some challenges that come up from that, and this forum draws on these themes and challenges. We've got 4 speakers today and plenty of time, hopefully, at the end for questions and discussion. We had, in the prep room just before, touched on a few items which immediately engendered some quite enthusiastic responses, so I think it's going to be an interesting 90 minutes. So without further ado, I shall start with by introducing our first speaker, who is Wendy Hardy-Coulter. She's an information management professional with an interest in information rights law. Wendy is also interested in the proposition of making government information more available for public use. In this way, better value can be extracted from our public investment. Wendy will provide an overview of some of the international initiatives around open data and how they might apply to us here in New Zealand. Please welcome her.
Good afternoon and welcome. Ready, steady, open data. I will present an overview of recent government open data initiatives. Open data has been given a green light, but before we pull away, we need to understand the wider rules around online information and data sharing and the implications of what is happening elsewhere, for example in the USA, the UK, Australia and worldwide. Why? Because it affects New Zealand choices. The reason why it will affect New Zealand's choices is because there is more than the licensing and the technology to consider. There are also the national laws of other countries, which are important factors. Why are these important? Well, we can share information online without understanding the laws which govern other people, or how those people may wish to interact with and reuse New Zealand government information, for example, or how we may wish to use other nations' information and data sets. We need to be able to set it in context with each other's laws. I think we've all been in this sort of situation, one way or the other. However, if we plan well and make intelligent choices, hopefully we will all miss the car crashes. I'm starting with the USA as my first example, because on the 21st of January 2009, President Obama's message came loud and clear when he said, "My administration is committed to creating an unprecedented level of openness in government. We will work together to ensure the public trust and to establish a system of transparency, public participation and collaboration. Openness will strengthen our democracy and promote efficiency and effectiveness in government." I think it would be an interesting exercise to gauge whether President Obama meant it was actually a move towards an unprecedented level of openness in US government terms, or whether he meant it was an unprecedented move by international comparison. Whatever the President meant, the copyright law of the USA and related laws contained in the Title 17 of the United States Code, Circular 93, applies to open data, and the agencies publishing their information have to abide by the law when doing so. The US Data.Government publication Concept of Operations Draft, issued by the Office of E-Government and IT Office of Management and Budget, provides a useful source of guidance for US government agencies to follow prior to the release of data sharing information. It's also worth a mention that Creative Commons was one tool offered. In the UK, on the 1st of January 2010, the Prime Minister sent an important UK legislation letter to Cabinet Ministers regarding transparency. From July 2010, government departments and agencies should ensure that any information published includes the underlying data in an open, standardised format. Of course, the release of the datasets specified in the Coalition programme is just the beginning of the transparency process. In advance of introducing any necessary legislation to affect our right to data proposals, public requests to departments for the release of government data sets should be handled in line with the principles underpinning these proposals. A presumption in favour of transparency, where all published data licensed for free reuse. Further guidance is available in the Code of Practice on Access to Government Information. It is 13 years old but still current. In Australia, there was a report from the Government 2.0 Task Force. It spoke in very similar terms to those of the US and the UK, and that it wanted to use technology to increase government, citizen engagement and collaboration in making policy and providing services which will help to achieve a more consultative, participatory and transparent government. So we keep hearing transparency, no real surprises, and again the consensus was to employ Creative Commons licensing. In New Zealand, well, there's no need to deal with these pieces of legislation and policy standards in detail at this time, but rather to draw attention to them as points of reference when coming to terms with and accurately planning any data release project. Following the lead of the US, UK and Australia, New Zealand will employ Creative Commons licensing. There are plenty of intergovernmental and transnational projects. The Creative Commons International has a scratchpad for referencing known government uses of CC licensing and public domain tools. This is a self-help webpage which asks for ongoing content updates regarding CC projects and initiatives. It's a useful source of information. labourforculture.org is a very useful directory of intergovernmental and transnational organisations that provide information, promotion and support for European cultural cooperation, which also utilises CC licences. The Communia thematic network aims at becoming a European point of reference for theoretical analysis and strategic policy discussion of existing and emerging issues concerning the public domain in the digital environment, as well as relating topics including but not limited to alternative forms of licensing for creative material, open access to scientific publications and research results, management of works whose authors are unknown, i.e. orphan works. Another point to mention is technological protection measures, TPM, employed to control access to or use of digital cultural collections, controlled online collections. These are defined in international legal documents as tools that prohibit use. Use is not prohibited by owners of copyrighted works. TPM are typically associated with controlling copyrighted works, but they can also be employed to control works not protected by copyright. So, if we had one wish, what would it be? What about an international technological and legal standard for data reuse? Can you please consider the usefulness of this question? To conclude, in all, there are a lot of different approaches to digital data release and information reuse. Our task is to find the best way forward for New Zealand's information in the global arena. I'm sure our next speaker, Keitha Joyce, will enlighten us. I look forward to your questions in the panel discussion, and thank you so much for your attentive listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. It's an interesting starting point, I think, because we're seeing from that picture that this is part of a much wider context internationally that we're dealing with at the moment when we're starting to talk about data and information reuse. And it's really in dealing with the digital context that things become a lot more tricky, perhaps. And how do we proceed is really a good question. And is an international approach perhaps a great way of dealing with that, given that digital content can be accessed from anywhere in the world at virtually no cost? Now we have Keitha Booth, our second speaker, who works for the State Services Commission and is a veteran of the NDF forums. Keitha has helped lead the current work in government and is doing, around open data, and in particular has been involved in the recently launched New Zealand Government Open Access and Licensing Framework. Keitha proposes that this framework can provide some of the necessary tools for all organisations with a publicly funded or supported role and mandate. This can help you in the task of making your content more accessible for reuse and perhaps deal with some of those challenges that we're being presented to by government. Thanks, Keitha.
Kia ora, everyone. And the New Zealand government is unlocking non-personal government information, data, content. There's a number of ways of describing it for some very compelling reasons. Making government's performance as open, as transparent as possible by releasing more performance information. Encouraging democratic involvement by the public in better policy development. And that's by releasing policy papers and the source data at the very beginnings, early stages of policy development. Stimulating economic growth by releasing government data at source and in formats that can be easily downloaded and used to create new products, new business, and stimulate economic growth. Reusing that data innovatively, creatively, or creating new design. So again, relying on useful formats and easy formats for reuse. And particularly relevant to you here today, accessing research results, culture, education, science materials, so that they can be repurposed and reused for new academic thought, new products, new use by communities. Oops, that didn't come. Beg your pardon. So that's those three. Those five. Contribute to transparency of government, more public participation, stimulate economic growth, promote innovation, build on research. And government, as we heard this morning, is saying, do it. The Minister has given the excellent background to quite a bit of what I'm going to say. So, as he said this morning, the directions and priorities for government ICT were released by him a couple of weeks ago, and Direction 2 of that new e-government strategy, 2010, specifically says support open and transparent government in New Zealand. So that's our answer to those statements that Wendy was referring to, particularly from the US, UK and Australia. And in particular, the Direction 2 is focusing initially on improving public access to government data and information, creating market opportunities and services through the reuse of government data and information. So that's fantastic that Cabinet approved that a couple of weeks ago. And they're also saying license your material when you release it for reuse. Apply the New Zealand Government Open Access and Licensing Framework. And many of you will be saying, what is this New Zealand Government Open Access and Licensing Framework? And there it is. It's up on the e.gov.nz website. And at the end of this presentation, I've got some links to it and the other items I refer to. And it's essentially guidance for state services agencies when they release their materials for reuse, advocating the use of the New Zealand suite of Creative Commons law licenses, of which there's 6. And here in the audience, we've got Jane Hornibrook from Creative Commons Aotearoa New Zealand at the Royal Society. And Jane's here to answer questions on Creative Commons licenses and when we move to the general discussion. Thanks, Jane. So, as you will have noticed, and as the Minister said today, NZ Goal is directed at government agencies, government departments, state services agencies such as Crown Research Institutes. So they've got to take it into account, they've got to become familiar with it, and they've got to apply it to material they release for reuse. But I'm saying to you, you can do that too. You can take this advice and look at how it will help you as you work through releasing your material for reuse. And why am I saying that? Well, it's best practice advice. It's been written by lawyers. It's had wide consultation in the open data movement. There's a number of people here in this room who've contributed and commented on it, and it's best practice advice for you to use. And it's relevant to the New Zealand law. And it provides a logical process for you to work through. There's a series of review and release steps for you to work through, so it provides a framework for you. And that covers licensing material for which you own the copyright and providing access to material for which there's no copyright. And it describes those Creative Commons licenses, works you through the process for what is best for you to use when you're releasing your material. And it also moves to situations where you may need to be more restrictive and gives advice on a restrictive license you may need to have drawn up for a particular material. And for those of you who are having to deal with whether it should be made available for commercial or non-commercial use and have to deal with those questions, it helps you there too. So it's there to help you. So what does it say? It's saying use the most open, the most liberal of the Creative Commons licenses, and that's the attribution by license, where you can adapt it and distribute it as you will, as long as you attribute the initial ownership to the copyright owner. So what does this mean? It means that as when you publish information, as well as putting up a copyright statement saying, copyright or Crown copywriting, depending on who you are, you also say how it can be used. You add a licensing statement. And for the non-copyright materials, you promote open access, say to the best of your knowledge, there's no known rights. Now this is a big change, it's scary stuff, and lots of people have been saying, how do we start? And we're very pleased that government's approved it. It's now requiring us to look at how we do release our material. And this was an email to me from a person in the education sector. And he's saying it's been really difficult to make headway. And NZ Goal, as we saw it was going to happen, that was made it a bit easier for us. But even now, it's hard to change people's attitudes. And when we have material we want to relicense more openly, people are reluctant to do that. So please keep helping us. And I think that many of you may resonate with those thoughts there. It's a big change. What a lot of us have been concerned about is preserving information, giving access to that information, but we haven't really been making it available for reuse. So how do we get started? There's lots of ways you can do this. Maybe you look at the material you release from now on, and in your publishing process you add a new process which is adding a license. Maybe you just focus on the material for which you are the copyright owner. Maybe when people ask for it, that's when you license it, so you've done that then and other people can use it. Or maybe you go back to first principles and draw up criteria for your organisation, and we're certainly going to be looking at that for government. Now, in the GLAM world, there's some people off the block. National Library have a digitisation strategy saying use most generous terms possible, respect intellectual property constraints, access for viewing, etc. will be unconstrained, use Creative Commons when it's appropriate to do so. And Digital New Zealand have released its digital guides under the Creative Commons non-commercial share-alike licence. Ministry for Culture and Heritage is saying, we're going to start with the images and interactive material we've created. And at this stage, we'll focus on that and not look at the text. We'll move on to that later. But we want to know what people are wanting us to release. Electronics Tech Centre is saying there's different materials which will be made available under different conditions. There will be restrictive licences also. In the education sector are planning a trial seminar encouraging open licensing of Creative Commons resources up on a portal which will again be available under a Creative Commons attribution share-alike licence. New Zealand On Screen, their interviews, they've released them under a CC licence, the non-commercial share-alike. Down to the Wire, the history of the internet, they have also. So these people are starting on this journey, just early stages, but they're good examples of people working in the GLAM sector who have started on it and who may be able to help you as well as us at the SSC. If there's anything that you feel that we can help you with, please contact me. And I'm at keithabooth.ssc.gov.nz. And see at the bottom, this presentation has been licensed with a CC BY licence. Thank you.
Thanks, Keitha. I think if nothing else, you prove that, especially with all those examples at the end, that the stuff is actually possible. And if we take off, bite off little bits at a time, we can do quite a lot with quite a little. I think the other thing I can be pleased to advise you now as well is that as soon as we can possibly arrange it, the Make It Digital guides from Digital New Zealand will be released under a plain buy licence rather than the non-commercial share-alike that we have at the moment. And that's in response to NZ Goal. So we're starting to get to that point where, okay, we've got this issue about opening this stuff up, and we've got maybe some tools here that Keitha has offered us that we could use if we are holders of content. How is this stuff going to be used is another question, and what are the barriers that still might be in place? Glenn Barnes, amongst his many hats, helps run open.org.nz in conjunction with Nat Talkington. Glenn is passionate about open data, and he will speak about the use case for open data and information. He sees 4 barriers to using data openly, which I'll let him talk about, and to overcome these barriers, and then if we've overcome these barriers, people will be able to make the most potential out of the open data and information that we might be able to make available. Let's find out what he's got to say. A round of applause for him to introduce him. Thanks.
Hi. I want to go over just 4 of the kind of the barriers or the things that we care about in open data. There's a few more, but these ones are kind of a bit more relevant to the heritage and GLAM sector. Restrictions on use, the cost of the data, formats and feedback loops. So I first want to cover the restrictions on use, and this is all to do with licensing. Now, when we come to use data, the first thing we want to do is we start looking at a data set, in this case a walking tour for historic Christchurch. Now, Christchurch City Council actually a little bit further on with some of their licensing, in that the material can be used for personal and non-commercial purposes free of charge without permission of the Christchurch City Council, provided that the source and copyright status of the material is acknowledged and it is not used in a misleading way. Great, you can use it non-commercially, so you can pull that data off and you can use it in your presentations and you can use it in your school projects and things like that. That's all well and good. Having a barrier up of non-commercial means that if you want to do something, you can then even put ads against the side of some mashup or create a mobile app and sell it. That puts a sort of a barrier in place. The other thing is, this is kind of like a non-standard license. It's not an NZ Gold license. And I'd really like to see, as we move forward, that more stuff gets licensed under NZ Gold, so you can look at that page immediately and go, I can use it, I can't use it, I might have to email someone and get some permission. One of our next barriers we have is the cost of data. And this can be a real problem. So I've got here a photo of Napier in ruins from Te Papa, and I'm not going to particularly pick on any institutions, but this is a good one to look at. Take, for example, I wanted to do a Napier walking tour and sell that as an iPhone application. The cost of that image is $22 for a digital download for personal use, and you have to get a quote for use in a presentation or for any kind of commercial use. And I'm still waiting to get the quote back of how much that would cost. Now, if I was going to do a walking tour of Napier, I might want 20 images at $22 each. It's $440. Maybe I only expect to sell 5 copies a week, if any. I don't know how popular this is going to be. And I'm going to sell the tour for $1.99. So minus the commissions, etc., I might make $6 a week in revenue, or around $312 a year. Take out all the other costs of creating the tour and including licensing content, and it will take years to recover those costs. So the results is I'll just flag it, and I'm just too expensive. I won't bother developing that walking tour. But the benefits could have been, and I'm in no way saying that my walking tour of Napier is going to save the New Zealand economy, but the more people who buy it, the more people spending time in Napier walking around, more people possibly spending some time in cafes and local businesses, more tax, more jobs, and I make some money, which means I can build my business and hopefully employ more people in the future. Now that's only one little kind of walking tour, but as we open the data up and there's like 1,000 businesses flourish that start using this data, hopefully the overall effect on the economy is we can start getting a lot more benefits. It's been proven in the geospatial space that the economic benefit of opening up that data for free has huge benefits in the long term. So just really think about that kind of charging for data. By charging for data and having non-commercial use on your data, it really, really stops a lot of really interesting ideas from even getting off the ground. Another one is data formats. Now, there we go. When you are publishing the data, any data is better than no data, so let's just put that out there as a start. But publishing just as a web page is not really open data, even though we can get around it. I've got a little asterisk there because just as a kind of proof of concept, we wrote a little scraper for the Historic Places Trust data that turns the HTML web pages into something readable, and which is essentially what the Digital NZ API does anyway in a lot of cases. But if you start publishing this data in kind of closed formats or just as web pages, in 20 years' time, will that still be readable? Will we still have the software available if it's in some proprietary format? So just think about that when opening the data as well. But don't let that be a barrier to even releasing it to start with. And the last thing, kind of one of the things we want to care about is feedback loops as well. A lot of the problems, a lot of people say, well, our data's not good enough, or we don't have it exactly right. By introducing feedback loops, you can actually help increase the quality of your data. Here's a picture of, from the Digital NZ API of a plant. It was on a particular track in New Zealand, right? So that photo plus the user-generated geotag equals happy campers, because we can start tagging. One picture of a flower is not going to be great, but if we're tagging hundreds of photos along a particular track, you can start to get a really idea of what that walking track might be like, and you can start really investigating and get excited about going on this one particular walk. And that's just one way where the user can help feedback data back into the organisations. But it's a two-way street. If you've licensed that image under a really restrictive license, do I really feel like helping you make your data better if I'm not allowed to benefit, more from that? But I wanted to also finish there with a good news story about how really open data has really helped. This is a picture of Santa Claus travelling to the Chatham Islands in the 70s, which I thought was pretty cool. I don't know if you know about OpenStreetMap, but it's a freely editable map of the world, and it started in the UK in 2004 as a replacement for the Ordnance Survey maps, which are closed. New Zealand's relatively unmapped, and some areas with good coverage, but others with not so good a coverage. And it's kind of like a free Google Maps or Bing Maps. So this is Google at the moment. When you look at a Google map of the Chatham Islands, there's nothing. We look at a Bing map, we have a few things there, a couple of roads, and I don't think the roads are that accurate. And now we have a look at OpenStreetMap. We've imported all of the LINS data into OpenStreetMap because they've got a really open licensing platform. And I can tell you where every cattle stop is on the Chatham Islands. I can tell you where individual trees are on the Chatham Islands, where the race courses and all of that. So who cares if we've got that into OpenStreetMap? I mean, what real difference does it make in the end? Well, one of my other hats is My Tours, which is city walks and museum tours. We have offline map access. There's no roam, so you don't have roaming charges, and we can't use Google Maps because of our licensing restrictions. Well, we actually use the OpenStreetMaps in that for that offline mapping. So the work that we've done on the open data side to bring that into OpenStreetMap has a direct benefit to our product in the end and allows people to not pay expensive roaming charges when they're walking around looking at the sites around the city. So that's just one way of, one kind of small example of how open data has helped to actually have real benefits to the end user. And thanks.
Thanks, Glenn. You've given us a taste, I guess, of how this stuff might be looking and being used out in the real world, if I can put the real world that way. It's an interesting challenge, I think, for us, because I know one of the big bogeys around usage is, especially in that commercial environment versus the non-commercial use area. A lot of us are quite happy where if we have content that we've digitized and put online, to have that appearing in blogs and used within the normal sort of limits of copyright law. But when it starts coming into these other environments, how do we deal with that as institutions? I think somebody who may have some thoughts on the matter, if no answers, I'm not sure, you'll have to ask him, but is Russell Briggs, our next speaker. He's the Director of Exhibitions and Programs at the Auckland War Memorial Museum, and in his spare time he also is the head of IT there. Initially, he was reluctant to be on this panel because, as he explained, there are so many competing priorities facing museums and his museum on both the digital and the non-digital front, that trying to get to grips with things like NZ Gold just seem a little bit too hard. So for me, that makes the Auckland Museum part of the real world, and probably a world which many of you in the audience are coming from as well. So what can you do? How can you respond as a cultural heritage organisation, and what's realistic to take on? Please welcome Russell to the stage.
I tweeted a second ago from on the stage and asked if there are actually any museum people in the audience, or all of them at the sexy social media forum happening at the same time. Museum people, anyone? Oh, actually there are a few. That's good. Because I'm actually not going to talk about open data. This slide originally said, open data, museums, what the fuck? But the lovely Virginia Gao, my colleague, who's far more conservative than me, had a look at that slide and said, are you crazy? They're videotaping this, don't put that on there. So I changed it to, huh? And Nat, if you don't think that's a beautiful slide, then, you'll have to just live with it. But what I want to talk about is what a museum can do to contribute to openness in general. And when we think of open, we think of open access more than open data. But I think they're kind of the same thing. And I would posit that what a government calls open data, a cultural institution would probably deal with in the real world as open access. Open data has meaning for subsets of museums. And I see Christina Tuatubo out there from our museum library, and she embraces open data in a way that other people that work in our museum probably wouldn't. But we all have to, within the museum, we all have to find a way to deal with openness as a concept. And for us in the last couple of years, arriving at an agreed definition of open access has been a difficult thing, but a rewarding thing, and we think we're starting to get there now. And I'll show you a few examples of what we're doing for that, and I'll try to relate it to what open data is. There we go. So the first question that we had to ask ourselves, which took 3 or 4 years to answer, and we still didn't, is does access transcend data or data transcend access? I think for governments that are coming up with policy, data transcends access, that if you don't create open data frameworks, if you don't have worthwhile things like NZ Goal, if you don't start to embrace Creative Commons, at least as a concept, if not in practice, and it's great to see it's being embraced in practice as well, then accessibility becomes sort of a moot point. For museums, I think that accessibility is the first point that has to be made, and that data and a commitment to open data flows out of it afterwards. So we've moved to kind of thinking about the former rather than the latter, but I think that over time they'll converge. If we're lucky, that convergence will take place just around the time that things like NZ Goal become ubiquitous, and then when they do, it'll be a lot easier for museums to meet that challenge. So what are we doing to create access, and what does that mean to data? Well, I've divided it into a few things. First is human access. You might wonder what that has to do with data, but if you can't get human beings in to interact with your museum in a physical sense, I think you're going to have a hard time getting them to interact with you in a virtual sense, and vice versa. So the first thing we did was we became free forever for Aucklanders. That's something that took 10 years for us to do. Having done it now, we wonder why we ever were asking for money from people, but that's another story. That's human access. There's content access, and this is probably a little closer to open data in its traditional definition. This is a program called I Am Making Movies that's coming out of our lifelong learning initiatives and our education team. And in it, we are, this is pitched at school children, primary, secondary, and tertiary at different levels. But it's an act of faith on our part of giving them content from the museum, either stuff that we own the copyright to, or things that we've worked with partners to be able to license, or public domain, things like that, and encouraging them and asking them to create their own films out of it, basically mashups, but interpretations of content. And then we ask them to share it back to us, and as a result of them giving their commitment to us to take our content and do something with it, we're committing to them that we're going to take it back. And in taking it back, that's actually a big thing that we're doing. We're a museum. In a sense, we're acquiring content, and then what do we do with it? And those are questions we're having to ask, but this is content access that did not exist in our museum even as recently as a year ago, so it's sort of a big deal. There was a whole session on this earlier, so I won't spend too much time on this, but recently our Cenotaph database, which has been around for many years, has had a major refresh to it, and I'm calling this partner access, because what we've now done is working with NZETC and ECT? ECC, you know what I mean. And archives, we're allowing to have transparent flow through between our Cenotaph records and military personnel records and other data, and this is something that's available to people that come through any of the three institutions' access points, and the data becomes transparent that way. And this is a major addition to Cenotaph, and a really welcome one, and it really rounds out the data sets that we have. And finally, meta access. I couldn't think of another word for this, so I came up with my own cute word that means nothing. But through the Digital NZ API, we're allowing access on other platforms for our content, and that's a commitment to openness that, again, this is a couple of years old now, this initiative, but even as little as 3 years ago, we wouldn't have let go of our content to this extent. So it's not purely the dream of open data the way that these fine people are defining it, but it's sort of that real world baby steps toward it, and creating a handshake with APIs like this is the way that I think traditionally minded cultural institutions can begin to open up the doors a little bit. You can't do an NDF without a quote from Paul Reynolds. We asked Paul shortly before he passed away to come help us on a digital strategy, and his comment when he looked around was, you people don't need a digital strategy, you need to run the museum in an entirely different way. which that sort of evokes Paul very much, I think. But he's right, because a commitment to openness, whether you call it open data or call it open access, has to be embodied in every single person that works in a cultural institution. It's not the new media group, it's not the library, it's not just the lifelong learning group, it's everybody, and if it's not everybody, it's a fail. And it can actually be an epic fail if you continue down that siloization route, and it can be quite divisive. So we sat and thought, well, okay, if we do put things together the way we want in the next couple of years, what are the signposts that are going to tell us that we've actually arrived at a kind of openness where I can legitimately be on the stage with people that are talking about open data and have it make any sense? And actually, before I go through these, the first thing that we should probably be doing, since Jane Horbrooke's in the audience and Keith is up here, is that having spent time with Jane almost a year ago now and promised I'd go back and take a look at Creative Commons license for the museum, and I haven't done it yet. We're behind, but I promise we will, because that would be the first commitment, is to get the museum to sign up for that. So that's the preface to all of this. So how do we know when they're there? Well, the metadata angel will be you, because it can't only be me. And when I say you, I would say that applies to museum staff, other museum staff, and not your new media group that thinks they have to do all the work but really can't. But it's also sort of a nod toward programs like what the social media people are probably talking about next door, where the Powerhouse put so much data out in Flickr Commons, and we're able to let people to add content to it and add their own metadata, and that kind of trust and that kind of faith is an indication that we've arrived. We're not quite there yet. Second, our researchers and curators will tell us why we need to be open, not the other way around. Anybody that's in a museum will probably feel that quite intimately. I don't think that needs to be explained, but it's really important. Our performance measures will credit giving stuff away. If your performance measures for a cultural institution are based around your visitation, your physical visitation, forget it. You're never going to be open. You're never going to make a commitment to open data or open access. If it credits virtual visitation along with physical visitation, they're a little way there. But really, it has to credit your commitment to allowing people to take your stuff away and do something with it. And if you can get your councils, our new Auckland Council is going to be our new measurement body, to credit that, then you're making a true commitment to open. And then similarly, when you don't have to ask us if you can use it because you know, because it has a CC license at the bottom of it, or because we're part of NZGOL, then that mutual understanding, that means we're almost there. And then that thing I referred to before, and it's actually secretly the most important thing of all, that we'll have a place to put everything you give us back as long as you want to give it to us. That's what the as long as is. And that's really important because we're a museum. And if you make something out of our stuff and you give it back to us, we have to have a safe place for it, and we have to be able to potentially curate it again later on. And if we can't do that, we're failing you, and we're failing the idea of being open. And the last thing I'll say is, again, invoking Virginia. When she came in, I had written this slide, and she poked over my shoulder, and she said, "Oh, okay, well, so you've written the digital strategy, so we don't have to hire Nat Torkington to do it now. Just show everybody that slide, and we're done." So thanks. You're out of a job, Nat. Sorry. Woo! Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay, so now this is your time, this is your forum, and we've got probably about 40 minutes or so, if we can fill that time, to have a conversation about this stuff and to ask some questions and get maybe some answers or some insights, both from the panel here, but also I'm a firm believer that the knowledge is in the entire room that we're in at any one time, so feel free to chip in some ideas and insights as well. I'm just going to open it up to anybody who would like to perhaps start out with a question or a comment.
This is mainly directed at Keitha, and maybe a little bit unfair because you did already sort of mention that it wasn't about privacy issue. information with the licensing, but we came across a situation a few months ago with a school photo that had been put up on someone's digital website. The school believed that it owned the copyright to the photo, but one individual in it, for privacy reasons, it wasn't about taking their name, they actually wanted their image of themselves as an 8-year-old taken down, and we were not quite sure where the lines in that were. Do you have any advice?
Well, all of our advice relates to non-personal information. I think that's a very good test case in your sector where there's often going to be photographs of people. And I can't give you the legal opinion on that because I don't know in terms of the Privacy Act, but I would expect that you would have to seek permission. But others here may have more specific experience in having to deal with that with their photographs, say at the National Library. Archives New Zealand.
But I did work at education, and we did have to be very careful when we used photographs of young students, even in our internal publication. Oh, right. I can't comment on that.
It's,
No.
it's someone who's now in their 50s. and
Yes.
a photograph of, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
They can object to it.
It certainly is a little tricky. I'm familiar with a number of sort of marginal uses. I mean, we're probably all familiar with Facebook and if we're thinking about contemporary or current photographs in terms of identifying other people, which you can even tag with specific names and link to their accounts. But we also have other sort of custom and practice that we're used to, such as websites like Old Friends, which has been around for years. And I mean, that's quite regularly encouraged people to put up class photos, for example, and tag people's names. And there's not much you can do with that information, but it's certainly up there. I know for the library, and I'm really just speaking from my knowledge, not on behalf of the library, that they've had a increasingly difficult time as we're starting to get into mid-century digitisation, mid-20th century digitisation. Most of the digital collections from the National Library are either 19th century or relatively early 20th century, and it is getting trickier getting into that sort of space. And there's been no one response for that because in some cases it's been, for instance, Evening Post images, and there's lots of individuals, lots of baby pictures and probably school students and so forth who are all published in the newspaper at some point in time. There's a sort of a get around for that, and that those images were published at some point or other. So, there's one angle on that, distinguishing between stuff that's already been published or not. But we've also had that come up with digitisation projects that we've supported through our Make It Digital Award, where there have been wedding photos and others put into, I think, the Nelson Photo News, where people had, got divorced or didn't want to have associations with that. So, my sense of it is you just have to go on case by case, and it goes back to my opening comments about building trust. The way that we as institutions or organisations can present the stuff online, the kind of code of behaviour and respect that we can put around that stuff will help. And in the case of the Papers Past website for the National Library, one of the things we had to develop was a takedown policy.
I was going to mention that.
Yeah.
You'd need to have a takedown policy.
Mm-hmm. There's lots of case law in the UK. J.K. Rowling, she was out shopping with her husband and a young child, and she won her case saying that this infringed her child's privacy. So, yeah, it's around.
You can always ask for forgiveness afterwards, right?
There's also the fact that law often or usually even is a bit behind in terms of technology, and the U.S. military in the last 4 or 5 years has almost perfected facial recognition software, and they've got effectively the Google for face recognition that's been used by the U.S. military internally, and I understand that that's going to be commercialized, and so they'll effectively be the ability to search on faces. And I understand it also works on faces over time, so that a child like this photograph from 30, 40 years ago, they can actually apparently, from a particular point in time on a photograph, work backwards or forwards and try to basically match. Let's say if you've got a photograph from 1990 and one from 2000, they can basically predict the 1995 photograph. Point is that the culture, both the outward culture, us, and the legal culture, is way behind this technology. And I think that as this comes to the fore, where people begin to understand that this technology exists, the law will eventually catch up and will start to actually demand our privacy, the privacy of our faces.
Is the Law Commission's reviewing the Privacy Act and the Official Information Act at the moment, and I'm not certain whether they've picked up on that type of issue or not. They've got a discussion paper on their website. It might be worth looking at that.
Yes, in fact, I was involved in that review. I belong to the Privacy Officers Organisation, and we had to go through about 200 questions and feedback on that review. But I think that if you look at what's happening in the US especially, they're miles ahead of most of the rest of the world, and I think what happens there, we get eventually. So just keep your ears peeled.
Yeah, we do have a situation where it's changing over time as well. So the expectations of a 50-year-old are different from the expectations of a 20-year-old, and those will change over time. So the curse of technology, particularly on the cutting edge like this, or the bleeding edge, is that it is always in flux. So you're going to need a policy. Some of it will be your legal obligations. Some of it, like, did you have the rights to that photo in the first place? Some of it will be your moral obligations to the people. I got kicked out of my sister's birth. She was giving birth to my nephew. I got kicked out because I was the official photographer, and I took a picture of the doctor before he'd done anything, and he was like, "You out." You know, how dare you invade my privacy? And like, mate, you're a bloody fixture to me. Like, no more interesting than the plumbing. I'm just documenting this thing because it's how my nephew came into the world. But he had a different expectation of his privacy than I did.
Keitha, and perhaps Wendy as well, just going back to NZ Gold and Creative Commons licences and the types of cultural shift that needs to happen within cultural institutions and within government agencies and government departments and opening up their PSI. We've talked about the kind of gut wrench that a lot of people have when they think about the potential commercial use that could be applied to their material down the track. But I was also thinking of what are the sorts of reactions you've seen here in New Zealand and in the UK to gut-wrenching reactions against derivative uses of work. What sorts of arguments do institutions and departments put forward for wanting to keep their data intact and not tampered with at all?
I haven't seen discussion of that type. The discussion that I've seen most is, you know, should we or should we not license our information, and there may have been quite a bit of unstated fear there, which could have prompted them to resist opening it up. But I haven't seen. I think there will have been. I just haven't seen discussion on those issues of whether we should be commercial, non-commercial, what happens with the derivative works. What we've done in NZ Gold to address any concerns about attribution of information when new data sets are created is recommend that there must always be a process for attributing the new data and dealing with that issue generally known as attribution stacking. So we've anticipated that type of question for data, but that's different from commercial and non-commercial use. Wendy, have you seen any evidence of that?
Obviously, as I was saying before about orphan works and people who have a copyright over items that they may have, if you like, donated to a museum or to a library, then even authors, you've got to be aware of how long that they can keep those rights. And some authors can have the lifetime plus 70 years, and in places like Germany it's different again. So you've got to keep ahead of the law and understand how that will affect what you're doing.
Any comment from you, Glenn?
Not from me on this one.
I mean, I think one of the challenges, and I know it's something that we've discussed in the library, because we do have a whole lot of different variety of content in our, both in our collections, but just in terms of stuff that we generate and produce as an organisation as well, including large tracts of metadata. Part of our challenge is actually not even knowing what these categories are in terms of trying to put stuff into those boxes and sort them out. So, for example, and I saw somebody tweet before and ask the question, you know, if you've got a blog with ads down the side and you want to embed a photo or some other information into your blog, is that a commercial use? If you've got, for instance, an iPhone application or some other which is actually sold, but the content itself doesn't come with the application, it comes through an API such as Digital New Zealand, is that a commercial use? Actually trying to work out what some of these terms mean in a, if you like, in a real world sort of practical way can be a challenge.
That's that whole commercial where the ads against blogs, and I mean, you know, I would see that as being commercial. You are making money off someone reading that content. And then the app thing is, it is really interesting. Like, if you sell the app, are you selling the framework or are you selling the content in the app? You know, something like what we do, you really are selling the content. I mean, the framework's just a delivery mechanism. But one of the interesting things, because some of the stuff in your collection has some restrictive rights, doesn't mean that you shouldn't license the stuff that is open under an open license. So, you know, hopefully, like, the stuff that is restrictively licensed, put that it is under copyright, but actually what would be really good for people wanting to use that data, because, you know, Joe Blogs on the street doesn't understand that someone gifted these photos to you and they put particular restrictions around it. They don't know that. They just think there's another photo in the archive. So maybe it would be good to actually explain, linking off and saying, you know, this is under a copyright because it was gifted to us with certain restrictions. And then I've got a long way to answering people's problems of why can't I just get this data.
Now, that's reminded me of a government agency, a Crown entity, that's the Standards New Zealand, who are a government agency who don't receive direct government funding. Their revenue comes from sales of their standards, and they are required to familiarise themselves with NZ Goal and use it where they can. And we went and talked to their senior management team, and it was really interesting to see how they had been considering what they would do with their material, which they sell, so that's commercial, but how they can adopt the intent and the principles of NZ Goal. And they said they've identified the material that they release, which is public good material. For example, their standards on buggies and their standards on children's nightwear, and all of that material is on the Ministry for Consumer Affairs website, and they're going to be releasing that with a CC BY licence.
Yeah, that's good, because the standards New Zealand stuff is expensive too.
Exactly.
If you're an architect or whatever and you need to buy building codes, it's
horrendous.
Cheap.
It's horrendous.
Well, you could say building codes are public goods, so we don't get liquid buildings, right?
That's true. I mean, I wasn't going to get into that discussion because I have views on that, having worked for engineers for a very long time. But it was good that they could say, well, look, we've got stuff that is released definitely for that social good, leaving aside that other debate, and yes, we'll release that for free under a CC licence.
One thing about charging, just to Glenn's slide from earlier about $22 for a download, and then how much it would cost. We were chatting earlier that a lot of the rates that cultural institutions charge for things like that are leftover charging models from the days where someone had to go find something in a book, photocopy it, maybe scan it, put it on a CD-ROM, post it out to somebody, and that was additive cost to someone's job. And so $22 for an image might have made sense at that point. Now it's virtually free because it's an image that's digitized and probably has been sent out thousands of times each time for $22. At some point, I don't think there's any sort of pernicious evil concept behind that of trying to raise shadow revenue. I think it's actually people haven't gone back and reinterrogated the policies and said, is it still legitimate to be charging this much anymore? And if it's not, is it okay to let go of that revenue stream in the name of taking these things and making them public and the attribution of their use being something that's important enough for the institution? And I think it's time that people like us need to actually take a look at those things.
And some of you will be aware of another all-of-government policy called the Policy Framework for Government-Held Information, and that has a pricing principle which says make information free where you can. This came out in 1997, so it was pretty out there at the time. But if you need to, you can charge for the cost of the dissemination of that information, and that is still done by many agencies. And so we are now reviewing that policy framework in the 21st century context and endeavouring to keep up with, or in fact, hopefully try and get ahead. And so we will be looking at that pricing principle, and that is also reflected in Treasury's charging principles, which of course local government take into account as well. So we are certainly at the central government level looking at that policy framework.
In the UK, they've come up with a really good idea. It's called They Work For You. And anybody who pays for information out of the government can publish it to this website, and you can go on there and search, so you don't have to pay for it again. So they're getting around that quite successfully, and it's good information reuse.
Yeah, there's a grey area here, though, whether information that's received via an Official Information Act request is still subject to copyright. Or is it as
and that's one of the challenges that I know that we have, because again it's going back to, as with Russell's comments, the same charging models and the same use models were sort of born of the same era in the 90s, where all the stuff was paper-based. If you released information under the Official Information Act, it came on a piece of A4 stock paper with released under the Official Information Act printed on the backside. Now this stuff is being released online, and when you shift from formatted, pages of A4 to perhaps data sets or other kinds of information that is also official information, that's just a whole different world, despite this copyright sitting on it. And I guess that's one of the drivers behind NZ Goal as part of that anyway.
And there is some clarity. Can I just finish that? Sorry. In NZ Goal, paragraph 22, copyright works released to a person following a request under the Official Information Act do not lose their copyright protection by virtue of being so released, nor does the fact of release entitle the recipient to use the works in a way which would infringe copyright. So in other words, if you request something from me, our agency releases it, it's only to you, you can't on-release it. Yep. So what we're suggesting that NZ Goal promotes proactive release of information, and in this particular context where a government department is releasing information under the Official Information Act, it releases it with a CC BY licence for everyone to use.
Cool. There's a question up there.
This is actually there's two interrelated questions. The National Library maintains a bibliographic database that it's sort of reusing to map out the relationships of whakapapa. And it only goes down to hapu, so there's no personal information involved. But in, let's say, the scenario where, let's say, we were to go out to the community of iwi across the country and say, please, let's go ahead and put all that information in, there really isn't a legal framework for that right now. Now, I know that under Creative Commons, I'm not sure what the status is, but I know that they were working towards a Creative Commons license for Indigenous people. But I'm not sure that would actually... This is more not a licensing issue as much as it is a intellectual property issue. And I guess the gist of the question is, who would the authority be in New Zealand for an organization, either the National Library or governmental nonprofit or an iwi, to go to work out the legal framework under which that intellectual property, Indigenous particularly, but might be any kind of personal information, could be mapped out? Who would be the organization that an individual or an organization could go to work through that?
You could start with the Privacy Commissioner, their office.
Could everyone hear that?
Can you repeat that, please?
We'll repeat that for the mic.
The government stream that you're looking for is actually in the Ministry of Economic Development. They have an intellectual property division there. Some of the work that they're doing is related to World Intellectual Property Office and the traditional knowledge stream. The core difficulty with that is that traditional knowledge is usually it's passed from generation to generation, and it doesn't work with the Western idea of intellectual property, which has a set duration. So, yeah.
We have a constant issue with that kind of thing because of the fact that we have such a large Maori and Pacific collection on exhibition, and at some point we had to just draw a line and say private photography and private filming of things that otherwise would require permission, and in some case research of the whakapapa in order to even find out who to ask permission from. Private use of that, I mean, it was sort of don't ask, don't tell. I mean, you can't stop it. You can't stop people from bringing cameras and phones into the museum. But just this morning, while we were settling down for the keynote, one of my colleagues I was sitting next to told me about a TV commercial, an advert that she saw over the weekend that was filmed in our foyer, and in the background clearly was Kave, our most significant Pacific masterpiece carving, for which we don't allow any commercial filming at all until permission is granted. We have a few of those that are significant Tonga, and there it is in the commercial. Don't know how it got on, and it's all over television now. And it's just one of those things where you just go, oh. So it's a very tough one.
I think one of the differences I see, and that's a useful case in point, is the kind of uses that we're seeing by, I call them commercial media organisations, as distinct from a lot of other commercial uses, which is really that mass audience sort of broadcasting or circulation of something where it's used in advertising, or where it's used in video footage that might be on TV or streamed on the internet. Those kind of large-scale uses, frankly, get all the headlines in a lot of cases, and they tend to hide that perhaps most of the more, I was going to say normal, but perhaps just the more usual uses of these things are actually much less traumatic, I suppose, in terms of that, and actually kind of mundane in some ways. I mean, I still have difficulty using images from some of our heritage institutions, just whether it's in blog posts or in online articles, where I just want a photo of something. You know, I want a picture of a postcard. I don't necessarily want to work out how to attribute it and format it and all that kind of stuff. I'm happy to link back to where I got it from, that's fine. But doing all that kind of stuff where it actually is quite a bit of a challenge, and going back to kind of some of Glenn's points around barriers for use, it's actually a very ordinary use if you look at what the internet has been doing over the last 15 years. It's only now that we're saying, okay, well, here's a protocol for asking permission, when in fact we've had at least a decade where people have just freely taken this stuff. So it's a real challenge, and I still think, and we'll go back to part of my opening comment again, that there's something to do with trust, it's something to do with respect, and some way of building, if you like, a community norm, rather than a legal norm around some of the stuff. We totally do need the legal framework that Creative Commons can fall back on in that more formal sense, but I think in terms of a lot of particularly heritage images where copyright's not the big question. It's actually around how the stuff is used, what context the stuff is used in, whether it's used and abused or not. That's actually the more critical stuff. I know the Creative Commons in the US was coming out, or has just come out with last week, if you missed it in the news, I did initially, the public domain mark, which is used for content which is known to be out of copyright around the world. So taking into account some of Wendy's comments about longer copyright terms, the best practices is only stuff which is known to be out of copyright internationally. One of the things that they were promoting, and I haven't yet found out what has happened to that as a community norm, is actually to have a statement from the heritage institutions, the most part of cultural institutions, providing that content that actually encourages their users to think and reflect about the way that it's been made available and the way that it might be used. So we can maybe make some distinctions between stuff that has a more sensitive value, whether it's in terms of whakapapa or cultural sensitivity, or whether it's just because that's somebody's photo of a formerly married couple. We just kind of make some of our own kind of decent rules around this. Still a bit more time.
Just Jane, do you have any comment on CC International's work in that area? And also, would it be valuable in just telling people where Creative Commons Aotearoa New Zealand is at this point? Thank you very much, Jane.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So Creative Commons in New Zealand is a local jurisdiction project of the main international organisation based in San Francisco and various places around the US. We have just sort of revived the project with new funding from the government in line with the NZ Goal policy, and getting people involved in Creative Commons licensing, educating about it, educating how to attribute works when you find them, all that sort of thing. We've moved to the Royal Society of New Zealand, which is providing a home for the project, and we have a very eclectic and great advisory panel, and Keitha is one of the panel members on the inaugural group. Just quickly in answer to the Indigenous Creative Commons licence question, the original owner of the Creative Commons project in New Zealand was Te Whanga Aranui, the Council for the Humanities, which is no longer a body, a sort of legal entity. It's become a committee of the Royal Society of New Zealand. And it was Brian Opie who suggested with Professor Susie Frankel that the Council for the Humanities, the Creative Commons Project and the Multi-Language Commission could not necessarily definitely make a Creative Commons licence for Indigenous knowledge, but hold workshops to discuss whether it's even a feasible idea, because as you know, the knowledge systems are very different, and I think it was just a sort of base to go on to see, look, is this even possible? If it is this something that we want? And as I understand, they decided to leave the process for a while till some other processes in that area had played out, and so it's at Susie Frankel's discretion to perhaps start those workshops and discussions again next year. So it's not something that's been left behind, but it's discussions that are perhaps in the works coming on. So CC International, as you said, Lois, have just released the public domain mark, and they're still very willing for people to give feedback on the domain mark. They've also updated the deed of the CC0 to try and be more in line, easier for people to sort of understand what's going on in the deed there. So it's definitely worth going and having a look at what CC International is doing on creativecommons.org, and also what we're doing in New Zealand, especially. We're at creativecommons.org.nz, and you can just come speak to me today if you have any other questions. Thanks.
It'll be fantastic if the public domain watermark gets embraced by New Zealand. I'll just tell one story, but if I tell the story, Dave Smith, you have to cover your ears because you're going to die when you hear this. For this I Am Making Movies Part 2, we wanted to use moving images. We used still images that we wanted people to mash up in the first iteration. And of course, for school children, we wanted to use moving image clips we could give them that were New Zealand-based, of course, New Zealand school children. And we had, again, cover your ears, Dave, we had so much trouble finding good pieces of public domain, easily available New Zealand film footage that was creative and interesting and had a beginning, middle, and end, and it was cohesive, that we could give to school children that they actually thought they were going to have to use the 1915 silent version of Wizard of Oz, which is in the public domain, and that's all fine, but think of what a shame it would be for us not to be able to, or Auckland Museum not to be able to give New Zealand film footage to New Zealand school children to play with. We did actually finally find something, and we should have gone to archives first and worked with them, but it was a lesson learned. But just to think that we might have had to use the Wizard of Oz is unfortunate, and if we had a public domain watermark to go refer to in New Zealand, it would have been a million times easier. So it's a great development, I think.
So a response from Dave coming.
He's going to kill me now. Hello?
I just wanted to add that under the Digital New Zealand Mash It Up type thing,
Mix and Mash. Yeah.
Mix and Mash, that hasn't actually been launched yet, but we've supplied about 6 hours of footage there, including stuff made before, is it 1946, the copyright cut off for Crown? And we've actually released that under no known rights, I think it is. So we've essentially released some of those films into the public domain now to see if people actually download them. But we'll have to see. Thanks.
I mean, it's chicken and egg. I mean, it's an interesting thing. I know for us at Digital New Zealand, for our Make It Digital guys, we have a number of, in fact, I think probably the majority of questions that we have are around dealing with copyright or the curly questions. And I kind of always get to the point where I think I understand it, and then somebody asks another curly question. It's like, I'd never thought of trying it like that. And it's really interesting too, and perhaps for me is an opportunity to ask Wendy a question around opportunities to collaborate internationally, because one of the challenges, I think, is understanding stuff that is relevant to this country's framework in terms of finding New Zealand relevant material that we can use quite freely like that, where we have to deal with all these international domains, such as the US and now Australia and UK, who have different copyright terms from us and different treatment for different pieces of work. We've had a number of comments around things like not so much The Wizard of Oz, but a number of other American films for use in things like plays and so forth as backdrop scenery, because they're public domain in the US, because the US owners didn't register the works. Those works generally are still, depending on when they were made, and the example I'm thinking of was made in the 1970s, are still in copyright in New Zealand, despite being in public domain in the US. And it's very confusing to know exactly where, and how you can use some of the stuff, let alone find New Zealand stuff. I don't know if you've got any comment on that, Wendy.
Well, usually the jurisdiction of where the work was made is the prime usage. But obviously, if you're using something from the States in New Zealand, then you get a double whammy. You have to look after what it was like in the States, and if it's got any relevance to law here. So I'd be very careful and look at both and hedge my bets.
Have you got any ideas about how we might actually get a more standardised, or a standard in the way that we can communicate this stuff?
We definitely need an international copyright law, because every different country has got a slightly different law. They've got different inclusions, different exclusions, and it just makes it a complete nightmare if you're trying to do trans-border movement of anything that's under copyright. So it is time that we started pulling together.
But when... Huh? Hello?
Yep.
But Wendy, wouldn't that mean that the international copyright law would effectively be the highest or lowest common denominator, or the most restrictive?
Like ACTA.
It could be.
I think that's called ACTA.
It could be. If you look at some of the laws in the UK and the EU, they're the most restrictive that there are. And now New Zealand are having to match those in order to do data work here. So, yeah, it does lead to problems, but you just have to decide which one you're going to follow. Yes, that's right.
And even even then it's not, it might not be, if we get an international law, it won't necessarily be retrospective either. I mean, one of the key things about New Zealand is, of course, we've got material that's ages old. Consequently, we're dealing with 3 different Copyright Acts just in New Zealand itself. So, 1962, 1913. So, even on an international level, even if everybody got their act together internationally, it still wouldn't solve our problems because we're dealing with old stuff.
Yes, what they'd have to do is retrospectively fit the fit previous copyright laws and bring them up to date and say, okay, these are repealed now, we're working under the international one, and then work back from that point.
In the meantime, I'd like to refer you to the slide I put up, which says, getting started options, which is, look at your new material you're releasing, and this may not be the most important of your material, but it is a way of getting your head around this whole process. And look at the corporate information that your organisation puts out, your annual reports, your publications. Put Creative Commons licences on them. Get that whole process into your publishing process. And then when they are searched on Google, you can do a CC search. You can, and picking up on an earlier point from you, Lewis, earlier, you can do a search for copyright Creative Commons licensed material, which you can then give to children or whomsoever to use. So that kills 2 birds with 1 stone. You're learning how to apply it. You're releasing easier information for reuse, and that then can be found online as well. And then also deal with that information which has clear copyright ownership and get that released.
And there was also a comment there, you're going to release some stuff and see whether people download it. I could also suggest that if people come to you asking for particular content and have a particular project in mind, work with them as like a beta tester of opening up the data, because there's someone who's shown they want to use your data and they want to do something interesting with it. Work with them to get the data that they want out there, and then you'll have at least one user. And if their project takes off, great. If it doesn't, hopefully you'll learn something. But if you're just going to put stuff out there that no one has requested, that's still good as well. But if people have asked you for stuff, that's a really good place to start.
Michael Edson's comment this morning was that we're doing this from a standing start, and I think we shouldn't underestimate that. It's going to take a while to warm up to all of this, both from the point of view of the organisations and institutions that hold the content, as well as the users who want to make use and access the content. I mean, half the challenge is just finding the damn stuff in the first place, let alone thinking up something innovative and exciting to use with it. I think there is actually, as well as sort of tackling some low-hanging fruit, there's also a question of quality when it comes down to it, because I don't know what you've got in your organisations, but there's a lot of crap out there, and there's stuff that perhaps no one actually really wants to use at all. And I know it can be easy to kind of put the really, really safe stuff, which is actually really low value, out there first. And I'm not opposed to that idea, but trying to find some, if not jewels in the crown, at least some slightly shiny glass would be useful amongst your collections in terms of making that usable, because we can't. There are only so many things that people can be creative about, put it that way.
There's DOCA grappling with that problem at the moment with some of their data. Their track data was, I believe, collected for more of a more as a kind of asset tracking kind of thing. So the track data isn't actually that accurate. It doesn't actually follow the track exactly on their coordinates. So, and
that's not important, is it?
Yeah, but it's important if you're going to blindly look at your screen and walk off a cliff. But I think they're going to put that out there, and they've built in feedback loops so that people can report issues and problems and feed that back into DOCA so that they can make their tracks better and upload that data. So if you do have rubbishy data, think about how people out there can actually make it better. That feedback loop is, because people who are passionate are keen to help you out as long as it's a two-way street.
Talk to people who are doing it. Northern Regional Council, for example, they've put out loads of their data on a Creative Commons licence. If you know them, get in touch with them, see how that's gone, what they've learnt from it.
Mm-hmm. question.
I think it's very important that we unlock as much public data as possible and just make it happen. But I'm wondering if you think that going on from that internationalisation of copyright, for instance, in 10 to 15 years we're going to have a different generation of politicians, many of them who've grown up with little respect for copyright. Is that going to make a difference internationally?
Anyone?
I think it obviously has got to be taken into consideration. My sons, for instance, they just go and get things off the net. It completely mystifies me, but that's what they do, apparently. But I think that law is something that has to evolve with the people. And as people's needs change, then the law must change with it. And that's what will happen.
I'm sure when they're running Disney, they're not going to be keen to get the laws changed, right? There's young people today, some of them are going to be running the content creation companies, so I'm sure they'll still be lobbying.
And they might have changed their name.
Yeah.
So their Facebook page can't be found.
Is there really going to be a generation of politicians that have no respect for copyright? I think it's almost almost like automatic. If you become a politician, you have to suddenly have. I don't know.
Well, the Minister of Finance reported to us that New Zealand adopting Creative Commons licenses for the NZ Gold was very enlightened.
Well, having a Creative Commons philosophy has nothing to do with having no respect for copyright, right? The two have nothing to do with each other.
It depends on the copyright law. We're nearly out of time. I know Jane wants to make a comment probably in response to Russell on that, but we have one more question there as well. Is that still... Yeah. Oh, okay, here, right. Sorry, no, it's two more questions. Okay, we can move quick.
I was wondering with the Creative Commons license, if we're having conversations with wider publishers. I had a conversation a few years ago, before Creative Commons have really picked up in New Zealand, with the Business Roundtable of all people. They would have been more than happy if there'd been a mechanism if someone had talked to them to make their stuff available. First person that talked to them was CCL, so of course they're getting licensing money for all of their content now, which they ironically would have been quite happy to give for free if the conversation had been had.
Okay.
That person's left now, though, Keith, so they might not. They might have changed their mind.
We'll have the question behind, and then we're going to finish with Jane with the last word.
Yeah, Northland Regional Council is an interesting example. It currently has 3 data sets up on the Coordinates website that have data from Landcare that they didn't ask the permission to use. We're under Creative Commons. That's also a very good example of a derived data set problem, because they took a subset of the Landcare data and all they did was change what was a code value to a label value, and they put it up as if it's a different data set. Well, actually, it's not as far as we're concerned. So I think, yeah.
Have you talked? So you've gone. I mean, those cases are going to come up, and that may have been an honest mistake, right?
Yeah. I'm not sure if it's an honest mistake.
Well, you got to get benefit of the doubt.
Enthusiasm to kind of follow the trend, I think. Yeah. But yeah, we will be following up with them because we would like to make that data available.
Yeah.
So I just think stuff like that's going to happen. You're always going to find examples where someone's ripped off your data and not used it correctly or not attributed it correctly. That's going to happen. Someone's going to do something, and we're in a digital age where you can steal as much content as you like, but we should be trying to encouraging the people who are reusing it right and pointing out to the people who aren't. At least be friendly to start with before firing the lawyers across the bow. And
the last comment from Jane.
And in response to that, I think people's idea of what a derivative work actually is can be quite hazy, in the same way an idea of what exactly is a commercial use of a work is quite hazy. And that's something that Creative Commons doesn't attempt to solve. It's something that's actually quite tricky in copyright law itself. So Creative Commons sort of steps away from all of that and just does what it can. But in terms of kids and copyright not mixing, I think Creative Commons is actually a really good learning tool for copyright, because you're saying to them, well, instead of you can't do anything, it's you can do this or you can do this, instead of you can't. And then they step back and say, what do you mean I can? Well, I do anyway. And it's actually a really good way of learning, well, if I can do this, there must be a set of rules in the first place that I didn't really know about before. So I think Creative Commons is a great way for promoting copyright and respect for property, actually. Yeah.
That's a really good note to finish on, I think. Can we hear the round of applause for the panel and for the audience that contributed? I believe there's afternoon tea or something, joining us outside.